Hello and welcome back to part 2 of the API Quick Start. And in this video, I'm going to try to focus on, I'm going to try to focus on devices and the export functionality. And I want to show some examples and also the block and its export capabilities so that you can see, as I mentioned in the previous video, that complexity which we've resolved in this REST API to help you kind of move forward and in terms of usage. To get quickly started. So the first thing is you're going to want to bring up the IPControl documentation for the API and CLI guide. And we want to look at is the init export. And let's take a look at the devices first. And what we should do is a quick search, and it should bring us down into the export device functionality. And we may need to do that twice. Okay, here we go. So when reading the export device documentation and how this function works, you have effectively various selectors that can be determined, which are the fields of that device. And those selectors can have different types of comparisons or comparators, meaning you can check for a host of an exact name, you can check for a host that ends with, begins with, or even contains by specifying the sequence of words together and anything that has that. And you can do that through this example, as you see, and they give you examples of that. Now, a key thing to note about this too is you can AND these field selectors together. So it can be one, it can be multiple, couple, several, many, and you can have OR functionality. So I can say whether it has this or that value equals or contains. And then the idea is that you want it to represent any IP devices or any subnets or containers or things that you've narrowed down and you want to filter out specifically to return an array that you're then going to further process. So as an example, if you are looking, say, for all routers or all IP addresses of a certain type, you can filter it out. And then as you supply the selectors, you then narrow that search to whatever specific range of addresses or scope, if you will, that you're looking to manage. So the selector names are basically what we're going to work with in the JSON, and then we're going to kind of concatenate these values here. And you'll see too that these are, single quoted if they're values that you need to be quoted, or just IP addresses and things if need to be set there. Okay, so let's keep that on the init export device, and then back in the Swagger, I need to make sure that I'm still authenticated, so I'm going to log back out, log back in again. Okay, and then we're going to navigate now the REST APIs, and the reason I mentioned when we were looking at the other API structure in the SOAP is because they organize it based on the namespaces. Now, in the REST API, we organize it based really by the data element itself, and then within those particular categories for that element, you'll have the various imports, exports, gets, and that namespace isn't necessarily sorted as you see it here, but it is listed like this so that you can see it. And actually, before we even continue here, let me show you a real quick thing that you can do to help you with this structure. This JSON, the swagger.json, is actually all of this data you see here in the REST APIs. And it also has effectively all of the namespaces, which you can filter out on. So one of the things I did yesterday is set up a real quick script to do this that pulls that JSON. And if I can show that to you real quick, it's very simple to do. And effectively all you need to do is in that curl, if you're looking at this, specify the JSON. And then I went out and told it to do a grep and then a slash and then a percent, $1, which is passing in a variable, which is going to be the namespace that I'm looking at. And then it pulls out and strips out some characters, but then sorts it. So I found that was actually useful. And then I could go in, and if I wanted to call the imports or the gets, I could see what that namespace is pretty quickly in a sorted fashion. So I thought that was kind of cool, and I just wanted to share that with you. And again, that here's that real quick capability, just kind of talking back to the executive in that Swagger JSON. Okay, take a screen capture there. And then to move on here, let's go into the export. So now in the init export, I mentioned previously that SOAP XML is a 3-step export. It's an initialization, it is an export, and it's an end, which requires a cleanup function. When we deal with the init export in REST, there are two key fields here, one page size, the other first result position. Their existence in the JSON means that you're both going to pass the filter and you want it to initialize, run the export, return all addresses or whatever number of page sizes you specify, and that you want that returned immediately and end and clean up after the fact. So if we were looking at a filter, and I'm going to kind of look back at my container name here, and it's ATL, and let's do container, and let's see what the field is actually. So it's capital C, so this is case sensitive too, so you need to make sure you have this. So I'm going to say container contains, and let's do ATL, because I believe that's the container I want. Now in the option string, there are typically, in some of these exports, there are capabilities to include additional options, and the documentation will tell you what options are applicable within that set. So as you see here, the one for devices is recurse container hierarchy. If you want to specify a container and then any subcontainers in terms of like exporting devices or blocks. So very useful, keep your eye on those, kind of read through those. But if you're not using that, you can just kind of leave it open there. And I'm going to return 1,000 rows. And then I'm going to return this basically two ways. As you'll see, it then is going to generate that curl syntax, our endpoint, and now I'm going to have a returned array. Here's our opening array, and then each of the objects of any of those IP addresses that exist in any subnets that have a container name ATL, and there's basically 2 or 3 here, and there's a number of subnets. So there's quite a few IP addresses that will return. And if you were processing this through script, it would be an array, and then you would walk through it and or search and do other functions. Now, on the flip side of this, and let's talk about the way that SOAP does this initially, is you set up a filter and you set up your options, and when you run it, it returns a context. This context then tells you certain things about the query, such as the query. It tells you here's the query that's actually being run. And if I were to copy this directly over to SQL, I could almost run this directly in SQL, if not directly in SQL, if I were trying to do a report or something like that. Now, another thing the key is the result count. Now here, because we're returning a context, and then as I mentioned, you have an initialization, then you have an export which takes a context, then you have an end which you pass the context into the end. So here, the only thing I have is just initialization. It hasn't really done anything else, but this is what it's going to do, and here's the return count. So if I were doing pagination, I know I can paginate 561 and probably do 50, 100 pages or 10 pages, etc. Now, in order to get to the data, of course, I have to then take that context, and this is kind of the challenge when you're trying to do this through the REST. You then have to open the context, and then paste what's out there, and then close it. So you then have to open it with a context string, which then includes all the context data, and then the SQL, and then run it. This will then return your results, so effectively the same thing. And I could specify here my page result size, only return 10, and then I can continue to run this command with the same context, specifying 10, until it gets to the end of the record set. So if I keep doing this, it should, continue through the list if there were enough to do that. Okay, so I didn't set any page size. The max results is 5,000, so it went ahead and it grabbed everything out there. But I could limit that again to do continue pagination. And then, of course, as you're done with this, if you're testing even this process, make sure you run that same thing. You then need to effectively take, and we should just go back up here and grab this, because this is then going to be, I believe, our end context that we're then going to tell it to clean up. And let's see if that works. All right, so there you go. That shouldn't return anything. So it cleaned up, and that's that 3-stage process. Well, That's no fun at all, of course. So if you do this through the initialization by passing your filters and passing your queries, you'll be able to quickly go in and do that and access that information. Okay, so that's the first tip, and to help you do that with that export functionality. Now, the other part of this is, as I had mentioned, is you can go in and you can specify and conditions. You can also search for user-defined fields. So that's a very common function when customers are trying to query data. So if we wanted to look at the same thing here, and I'm going to clean this out, and let's start with a new filter, and let's tell it we're going to do 1,000. And in this string now, what I want to do, and the way that we represent fields is UDF, and I have a field called VLAN ID equals, and I can specify a number. And I should be able then to do a single quote because it's a double quote opener. Let's try 301 and see if we have one in there. I can then tell it to recursively look through if I were doing container name, but I'm not, and see what we have in the list. Okay, I don't have anything there. Let me check my data real quick. Okay, so I'm going to actually jump up here. So I'm going to check the VLAN ID. So here's where we're going to jump into the blocks in my second example in this video, and then I'm going to, we'll kind of call it there, and then we'll try to move forward a little bit with some other functions. But in terms of the blocks, when we do the init block function, there's a couple things. One is there's a representation of a block, which gives you things like the get block, which already exists, to split, and do some of the other modification capabilities. But then there's a child block, which represents your actual subnets or aggregation of type blocks. So it's here under the child block that you're going to have the init export child block. This one, though, if you look at this, you'll see this a little different. It doesn't have a filter. It actually has a word called query. And within that query, then we're going to, I'm going to paste this and change it because I already have it. And I'm going to change filter to query. And effectively what I want to do then is my UDF dot the VLAN underscore ID, which should be the name of the field name tag of that UDF field. And then I should have a value out there, and I'm going to try this, and let's see. So I got an error here, so let me check on my detail. One second. Okay, if you were watching along with me, you probably caught a lot of errors. So let's go through everything again. Misspelled query, I had QWERTY in there. Going to the keyboard. Make sure you just have query. We've got udf.vlan ID. You do need single quotes around this. I also had excluded the include free blocks. So this structure here should be what we need to return 1,000 rows of anything with UDF VLAN. And we run that, then you'll see here again, we have an array. So if you were, trying to identify, subnets, and let's think about this in different ways. Let's think about it in a multi-tenancy or in terms of a service provider. You're a service provider, you have customers, customer subnets, and containers. They're represented in a container, and a container has a field, and the field has a customer ID. And in that search, you could literally specify a customer ID and get back all subnets. Or you could even go back in and further add to this and say whether that, and we could do block type equals, let's say if there's one called data. I don't know that there is. Let's see. Ah, there it is. So, we could and it this way, and then you can continue to do this and ors to this to help, again, filter the data. So the key to this is whenever you have multiple records that you want to extract to do something with the data, you use exports. And with REST, you can do the init export of that method, and it gives you everything back that you need, and you can filter and do multiple checks on it. So that's the key advice, and that's the key concept here as you move forward. And as we move forward, if we're doing anything with exports, I always do it through initialization. And if you're using some of the older backward compatibility, you have to, again, copy those things in context. But the context then gives you the ability to determine the record size and paginate if you need to do that. So thanks again for joining. And again, I hope that in this series of videos that you'll start to begin to pick up on these little key things that'll help you move forward in understanding your data and tracking the information. And as we move forward with this, I'll give you some other examples too, where we get into those APIs and maybe even, we eventually get back into the workflows that take advantage of this and the Node-RED and the cloud automation. So take care. And if we don't see you again this afternoon, have a great weekend. And I'll probably try to pick one or two up this weekend and they'll be out there soon. Take care.